The following is a tale of Louie Monaco, a character I've known, seen through the eyes of his son Ardo Monaco. The transcription takes place in November, year 2000. When my dad was a young boy, he lived on a farm in Italy. It was dirt poor. They lived in a very small two-room building, an adobe-style house, when he was 5 years old. Their plot of land was 5 to 6 acres in size. They had oxen, even though he loved horses like I do. One of the reasons for having oxen was it provided them with heat. As the barn was built directly to the back of the house, the heat of the animals would gradually warm the house at the same time. They grew vegetables and had chickens. Despite women not being treated well, they were very tough. Grandmother could plow a field and on Sunday take a pair of oxen and go to church. Once a week they sold their wares at a curbside market, a place where you could trade and buy and sell just about anything. He and the other boys took all the sheep and goats to the town pasture. His father came to work on the subways in New York City and left his mother in charge while he had fun in this country. When his father came back, he had lots of interesting adventures to share with my father. These stories kindled an advent desire to come to America. Father saved money every week, a few pennies, a dime for herding sheep. His brother had come over to work on the railroads and had already arrived. At 15 years of age, although Dad was half-starved, he managed to save between $30 and $40 to make the trip to America with 5 of his friends. The friends pooled their money, each of them between $25 and $30, and bought cheese, spaghetti, bread, and olive oil. They ate these on a 21-day voyage to America on a passenger ship which was furnished with heat, a coal stove. The poor people traveled down in the steerage. They hung up curtains to mark off their space and were shipped just like cattle. We call the boats cattle boats. They landed in Boston. In order not to be considered a vagrant, one had to have $25 or $30 in one's pocket. In order to be admitted into the country, you had to have a sponsor. So his brother Nick met him at the docks in Boston and signed him in. You had to have a benefactor so you wouldn't be considered a burden on the country. The 5 boys stuck together with Dad's brother and boarded a stagecoach headed for Bangor, Maine, where they started working on the railroad. Other men were working on the railroad in Boston, and they were to meet in the middle. They lived in boxcars, worked 6 days a week, and were paid 50 cents a day. With their first pay, they pooled their money and bought a wash tub. The slow but steady progress of the railroad moved 10 miles a week. After a couple of weeks, the boys had their picture taken so they could send it home and put on a good show for the people back home. The photographer would furnish all the fancy clothes, the derby hats, the button shoes, and the special slicking for their hair to make them look nice and good. Finally, those working south connected up with the gang going north. At the time, in Elizabethtown, they were attempting to build a county seat. They needed a railroad. The politically connected men in that town put up the money, and they started building a railroad. That's how Dad and his gang came to Westport. They worked like mules and were being constantly threatened by the foreman, who was also Italian, that they would be shipped back to make work for other men that would work harder. It was a custom in those days to have the same nationality foreman as the gang, etc. An Italian foreman with the Italians, an Irish foreman with the Irish. When the railroad stopped in Westport, the guys had to find something else to do. One of Dad's friends, Scott, moved to Port Henry. Another fellow, Nick, became a shoemaker and moved to Lake Placid. Dad stayed in Westport and set up as a shoemaker. He had a small room, 10 by 15 square. He divided the space into 2 parts by a curtain. His living quarters were in the back. In the front part, he created a shoemaker shop and went to repairing shoes. He didn't know how to do it, but that didn't stop him. After having seen someone else repairing the shoes, he figured that he could do it. He got some shoes from some of his friends and piles them up in the window to make it look good. I have to say he was a shrewd businessman. There was another cobbler in the town. This fellow came over and said, "Look, there's not enough business in this small town for both of us." Dad said, "Fine, I'll buy you out." This had been the man's home for a long time, and he had no desire to leave, so he said, "Well, look, I was here first. I'll buy you out." I'll give you $25. No, my father said. $50, 'cause I have all the business I need. The man paid the fee, but he made Dad promise to move out of town and never come back. Dad's brother continued to live in Westport as a laborer. He married Hattie from Port Henry. They had 11 children and lived dirt poor. Dad and Mom helped them out whenever they could. For example, Mom brought each of the children one at a time into her home during the summers and taught them manners and cleanliness. Out of these children, one daughter married into a wealthy family. The rest continued to struggle financially. Dad, as per his agreement, left Westport and made his way into the town of Elizabethtown. There he made his first deposit of 10 cents to the Lake Champlain National Bank, where he continues to do business with for the rest of his life. He rented another small room there on Main Street, right at the foot of the hill. There used to be a small drug store and a big grocery store side by side, and next door was a little diner. He set up a shop there, a little shoemaker shop again, and then he had a few customers, but not too many. He wasn't doing too good in business. One day a girl walked into his place. She wasn't more than 15 or 16 years of age. She said that she wanted to get her shoes fixed. She questioned him about how good a shoemaker he was. He said, "I'm a very good shoemaker." She said that these were the only shoes that she had, and she wanted to make sure they were a good job. He said, "I'm a good one, 'cause I'm a very good shoemaker." So she left them with him. Then he told her to come back in a couple of days. When she came back in a couple of days and asked for the shoes, he gave them to her. She looked at them and threw them on the counter and said, "Terrible job." She refused to pay for them and wanted him to pay for a new set of shoes. "Oh, no, no, I no pay for your shoes. I'm a very good shoemaker." He talked to her in broken English. She said he did a lousy job and wasn't going to pay for them. They argued for quite a while over it, and finally he said, "Looka, there's no need to argue. Why don't you come with me? We go get a cup of coffee. We discuss it there." So they closed the door, and I don't even think they locked them back then. They went to the place next door, the little diner, and they had their coffee and donuts. Whatever they had, they must have calmed down quite a bit, 'cause he asked her to take her to the movies. He said, "I'm going to take you to the movies to smooth it over." She agreed. So he took her to the movies on Saturday night, and 2 or 3 weeks later they were married. God, I wonder what the name of that picture was. That's when he met my mother, Ida Martin. So my grandfather wasn't too happy about her marrying a Catholic. She was an Anglo-Saxon or some sort of thing. Dad always wanted a horse, and Gramps said that he should get a horse. "You can't live down there. You're going to have a different place to live. You're living in that one room." Of course, he didn't have any money. I guess it cost $2 to get married, and he said that was a house up the road, and you could get real cheap, you know, a couple of bucks a month. So Dad bit the bullet, got married, rented the house, and he and Mom moved in. They moved in there, and there was a job at the American House for a cook in the winter time, and my grandmother used to cook there in Au Sable Forks. They moved over there, and my mother was pregnant. My grandmother was going to work all over there. He was a horse trader, my grandfather was. He used to fix horses' teeth. His name was Jim Martin. That's how I traveled all over the North Country when I was a little kid. I've been to Malone and Rutland, Vermont, Plattsburgh, Port Henry, Keysville. I mean, every place. And of course, Grandpa always rode good, fast horses. He was a hot rod when it came to horses. They moved over there. He was born over there at midnight sometime, November 15th, 1913. So when I was born, it was colder than hell. My grandmother, mother, father, and Mrs. Stevens, a midwife, helped the doctor, Dr. Smith, deliver me. He came to the house. In those days, they always did that. They always come to your house. He charged my father $2 for delivering me, and of course, the midwife, she did it for free. While we were there, Dad started a meat market. He wasn't a very good meat man. We stayed in Au Sable until spring. Then my grandmother had to go back to work at the Deer's Head End, so Dad sold the meat market and went to work for a man named Victor Prime. Prime had a wagon business. When cars came along, he got a car agency. He was looking for a mechanic. There weren't many mechanics back in those days. My mother waited table in the chauffeur's dining room. I was a baby, so she left me with Phoebe McDoobit, and Phoebe lived with Dad, Mother, and me in that tumble-down house. Mother earned $3 to $4 a week and gave Phoebe a couple of dollars. She came from a big family, and they were glad that she wasn't home. She was a live-in babysitter. Dad heard that Prime needed a mechanic, so he went up to Prime and said, "Yes, sir, I know all about cars." I don't think my dad had ever seen one before, but he said, "Yes, yes, I'm a first-rate mechanic." Prime said, "Good, that's just what we need because all these people come in here." Well, there were only about 3 or 4 cars in all of Elizabethtown. One was owned by Judge Hands and the doctor. Prime himself had a car, and the man that owned the Deer's Head Inn had a car. The rich summer people had their chauffeurs drive them to the Deer's Head Inn or the Windsor Hotel, which was another big hotel that'd stay all summer. Then the other people come up by train, and the stagecoach would bring them into the Deer's Head or the Windsor. Well, there was another group that came all the way from New York City and used to stay at the Windsor. Dad told me years later when they took on an agency, they had to have all the parts that go with the car. So you get an agency with 3 cars, and you had all the parts that went with all 3 cars. He said, so if something didn't work on a car, I'd figure out what I thought it was, and I'd just change it. And if it didn't work still, I'd change something else. Then I'd know that the first part wasn't anything wrong with it, so I'd put it back in the box and throw it on the shelf, and I'd keep doing this changing till I found the bad part, and then I'd throw that away, and I'd put everything else back on the shelf. And, the car would run, and I said, boy, that guy's smart. And Dad said, you set your mind to something, you can do anything you want to in life. Well, he worked for Prime for a while yet. Then he decided that he wanted to move downtown. When he moved downtown, I was about 5, and I stayed with my grandmother, Julia. She was terribly fat. She died when she was about 26 years old of heart trouble. Everybody loved Julia Martin. When anyone had trouble, they went to see Julia Martin and see what she thought should be done. One of the girls was in trouble, they went to Julia. Everybody went to Julia. She was such a wonderful woman. My grandmother had a little pony about the size of Brownie out there. Brownie's like a little Shetland there. My grandmother drove a pony to work every day in a little red wheel buggy, and I would go with her. Since she was kind of heavy, Grandfather put another leaf spring in there to help level the wagon off. Often, it'd tip a little bit one side to the other, but I don't think Grandpa ever told her he put that extra spring in there. I'd go to work with her, I'd spend a lot of time in the stables of the Deer's Head Inn with the horses. Then at night, we would hook her pony up for her, and we would go home. In the fall, it was fun because all the leaves, and you could hear the clip-clop of the horses. You'd hear the creak-crack of the wagon. The birds would be flying, and I'd say, "What's that sound, Grandma? What's that sound? What's that flower?" And she was my encyclopedia. She'd tell me everything. Have you ever noticed a street light? When you approach a street light, your shadow is there, and when you walk close to a street light, your shadow gets smaller and smaller. And then you go away, and the shadow gets longer and longer. It used to fascinate me. You'd look at the shadow, and it would be this short, and then all of a sudden it would stretch out to infinity. Then we go by the next light, and he would shorten my shadow up again. I was always looking for swamp fire. It's sort of like lightning, something to do with gas, I guess. Everyone had a pony. Grandfather took good care of them. I still have a picture of my mother with her horse. She was a scrawny-looking little girl, but the pony looked okay. We would sit on the porch when we got home, and she would be there fanning herself. I'd sit in her lap. She'd say, "Hear that? That's a thrush. Hear that? That's a chipmunk." I learned the sounds of all the animals. I knew all the trees and all the flowers. Today I can't remember all of those. They had a schoolhouse, but they didn't have a school bell, so Julia got everyone together and raffled off the girls' box lunch, and you ate with the girl who'd lunch you and bought the box there, and she'd raise money like that, and then she put on a home talent show. She sent away for a stage hook, and of course they didn't have a stage, they just had a schoolhouse. They had a curtain, and they hung up a bedspread, and they put on some good hometown shows. You could rent some of the customers. They were that good. So they invited her to put on these shows in Elizabethtown and Essex, and she raised money to put a tower on the schoolhouse with a little bell in it. The day they rang that bell for the first time, they had a picnic. Hell, any excuse was good for a picnic. I remember the night that we had the armistice. Of course, I didn't know what armistice meant. I remember my grandfather got the big hay wagon out. Word spread around. Then everybody in that little settlement, Scrabble Hollow, 12 families all. We got all the families and all the kids, food and everything. We drove all the way down to Elizabethtown because they was going to have a burning of the effigy of the Kaiser. Of course, I didn't know what any of it meant. So we went down, and there was the Kaiser Wilhelm hung up on a big pole. And they had a big bonfire, and they burned everything that you wanted to get rid of. And they started as soon as it got dark. And they had a band, and they set that bonfire, and it burned all through the night. And people were hollering and singing. My aunt was there with her boyfriend. I used to call her my aunt, Aunt Ding. Her name was Pauline. That used to embarrass her, especially in front of her boyfriend. That night she picked me up in her arms and said, "If you promise me that you will never call me Aunt Ding again, I'll get you one of those big white teddy bears." Now, I always wanted a teddy bear because I never had one, and by God she did. She worked in Albany as a waitress, and she wanted to better herself. She would come home every month or 2 months. My grandfather would take a surrey and take it to Westport Station and wait for the train to come in and pick her up and bring her back to Elizabethtown. Then she got ready to go back, we'd take her down. The horses would raise hell. Of course, there were a lot of other wagons there, too. The train came in, they'd raise holy hell. Horses didn't seem to like the train too much. We'd pick her up at 4 o'clock in the morning when the train came in. After the armistice, we lived in Scrabble Hollow. Later, my aunt had to change the name to Pine Grove because she thought that it was degrading to call a place Scrabble Hollow. Now the people who moved back there think it's cute to call it Scrabble Hollow. Anyway, we were all hard-working farmers. I remember one late afternoon we were at my grandfather's and I was walking up with Phoebe and Mother. In the meantime, I have to tell you the house that we originally lived in burned down. My father was in the woods with the horses working. He came back and he could see the house burning before he could get there. They built us a shack. It was a 2-room shack. 2 rooms about that size, you know, small. There was a kitchen, bedroom, and everything in one, and there was the living room and whatever left in the other. Dad decided that he wanted a car. We came outdoors and all of a sudden I said, Hey, Ma, there's a car in our yard." In those days, having a car in the yard was a big deal. We kind of hurried out and Mother said, "What's going on? Who's in the house?" Dad said, "Nobody." She said, "Well, what's that car doing there?" He said, "That's ours." She said, "What do you mean ours?" He said, "Well, I got it so you'd have a car." She said, "We can't afford it. We hardly put food on the table." He said, "Look, dear, I got this car so you could take your mother for a ride once in a while." She said, "Where'd you get the money?" He said, "I didn't get any money. I traded the cow for it." My God, all hell broke loose. My mother had a pretty good temper, I tell you. She said, "Now, where are we going to get milk for the kid?" And he said, "Your mother has a cow. I tried to do something nice and now you're mad. I was doing it to be nice to you." So she said, "All right, fine. If that's the way you want to be, let's go for a ride." He got Mother in the car and left me with Phoebe and took her down to pick up her mother and drove downtown. They had a mother-in-law seat in the back. Father said, "Where do you want to go?" And Mother said, "Take me right down the main street and right by the Deer's Head Inn." She wanted to go down there so anybody that was going to see her could see her. Her first big encounter with an automobile. So that winter he decided that he wanted to go to Florida. So they got Cecil Burpee and his father and mother, and they had a car, and they said, "Let's all travel together." There were no motels. There were hotels, so you could either sleep in a tent or you went to a hotel. Well, we couldn't afford a hotel. We couldn't afford to eat in restaurants, so we took our tents. As I remember, Dad had a tin stove, but they had a new car, a 1919, and we had an old 1914. Our car was worn out before we started. We got 2 books that showed us how to go to Florida. They show you how to turn there and turn here. You turn at the old Red Barn. Some of those roads that days didn't even have old route numbers on them. You go down Main Street for far and far, and you turn at such and such a statue. You go into the country at the Red Barn, you turn right, you go 4 miles until you come to a big maple tree, and you turn right and go 20 miles straight on. And that's the way you do it. Well, we had 2 of those type of books he found from the AAA. We went to Florida, and we got to the Carolinas and Georgia, and he even let me drive. I was about 7 or 8. There were no age limits back then for driving. We got to Florida and spent the winter down there. My mother would take orange crate and muslin, and then in the tent she would make a cupboard for her food and stuff. We cooked outdoors. We ate and cooked under a canvas and slept in a tent. We had a chair here and a chair there, and Dad worked in a Model T garage down there, and they traded cars. Dad would buy the used cars for $10 apiece and bring them back to Orlando and use them. If they had a little dent, he would straighten it. Mom was pregnant with Jimmy, and during the day he would let her sand off certain rough spots, and then he painted them all yellow ochre. He'd take them down to the black section, and those blacks would just go crazy about those cars. He sold all he could get a hold of. They just loved those yeller cars. He made enough money and bought a train ticket and stayed for 4 or 5 days with some people my grandmother knew, and it was great. I saw a lot of New York City in those days. He decided that he didn't want to work for anybody anymore, so he went to Mr. Prime and told him that he wanted to be his own boss. Mr. Prime asked him what he wanted to do. Dad said he thought that he would ask him. He said, "Well, I'll tell you something that I do have. I have a grocery store in the town of Upper J." Dad said, "Yeah, I know where that is. I've been through there when I was trading horses." "Well, I have a grocery store over there, and if you'd like, I'll sell it to you." So Dad and my mother came over here in a Model T Ford, and I was standing in the back. I remember part of the road was dirt road, and we came over. We went to the store, and there was a meat market, and part of it was a general store, and inside was a great big Wurlitzer that played the piano, drums, the violin. Huge thing. So he went back to Mr. Prime and told him that he wanted to buy the store. "How much you want for it?" Mr. Prime said, $800. Dad said, "That's good." Mr. Prime wanted to know where Dad was going to get the money from it, and he said, "Well," he said, "I thought you'd loan it to me." And Mr. Prime said, "Wait a minute. You want me to loan you the money to buy my building?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "I'll give you 2%. Mr. Prime said, "You know something? Somebody that's got the arrogance to ask him to sell me the store and then ask me for the money to pay for it, I'm going to let you have it." Dad wondered how he was going to get started. In those days, you could buy groceries on a 90-day payment. Then they cut it down to 60, then 30. Now you got to pay cash. He got it under a 90-day payment. "If I pay quick, I'll save all that extra cash." So he had somebody paint a sign that said Monaco's. He was mad at that. He was mad because that was not how he spelt his name. He said, "Well, that wop over there will be out of business in 6 months. They figured on how can you sell stuff for cash." Dad got the money right in his hand. The reason he could pay cash was because he was collecting cash. The bootleggers had started moving through here, and they would stop there. They would want bologna to make sandwiches and stuff, and then he decided to do away with the store. He went over to Keith and Branch and said, "Would you like to buy all my merchandise? I'm going out of business." Then he turned the place into a restaurant. Now all the bootleggers that came through would stop and eat here. Restaurants were few and far between in those days. Then after a while he decided to build a garage, 50 or 60 foot by 100. He catered to the booze people, the bootleggers. They would say, "If you can get to Louie's garage, you can be guaranteed that you won't be arrested, because if they were being chased by the revenue officers, the minute they'd drive into the garage, the doors would be shut. The mechanics would then shut the doors, and maybe 5 or 10 minutes later the revenue officers would show up and they'd say, 'We want you to open those doors.' And Dad would say, 'What for?' They say, 'We think you got a booze car in there.' And Dad said, 'There ain't no booze car in there.' And they said, 'Yeah, we want to inspect it.' And Dad would say, 'Well, you can't inspect it without a search warrant.' 'Well, we don't have a warrant. You can't get one every 5 minutes. Come on, Louie, open up.' He said, 'I'll tell you what. I'll have something in there for you if you want to wait a minute.' And he'd go in the garage, and 2 or 3 of his flunkies would come in. They'd get a case of scotch, and they'd put it in the revenue's car. And he said, 'There ain't no bootlegger in there, but I did find this. They must have left it in there.' So after the revenuers left, he'd open the door, and the bootleggers would go out and leave for New York City. He protected them. He was good friends with both the troopers and the bootleggers. He would tell the bootleggers they'd have to leave a couple of their best cases of scotch, because that's what he used to get the troopers to stop chasing them. And so he made a lot of money, and he used to send the money to Elizabethtown by a fellow by the name of Abel Sims. He had a special car that he drove for that, a Buick Roadster, and he would say, 'Now you go with Abel to the bank.' His theory was, if you saw Abel, who was about 16 or 17 years old, with a little kid in a car, no highwayman would stop someone with a little kid in a car, because they figured he wouldn't have any money or booze on him. The revenue men would chase the bootleggers, and if they caught up with them, they would arrest them, put them in jail, take their car away from them. They'd confiscate their booze for state's evidence. The booze could be worth up to a couple of $1,000. If they could get into Dad's garage, it would be safe because he had a sort of agreement that he would give them gifts of liquor which they themselves could sell or drink. They were all drunks, those cops were in those days. One day a fellow came by the name of Big Odo. Later he was up in Chazy and he stopped his car to get a drink of water at a brook because they didn't have any stops at gas stations, so he wouldn't be recognized. He was bending down drinking out of the brook, and the revenuers and the state trooper sneaked up on him and shot him right in the back of the head. The blood ran right down through that brook for, I don't know how long. They would bring a car in there, and sometimes they were afraid of being recognized, so Dad would paint the car and hope they'd stay all night. He was smart. He said, "I'll paint your car green, so you can have supper here, and you'll have a room. In the morning you'll have breakfast, and I'll fill your car up with gas, and you'll have a new-colored car. You take off and be safe until somebody recognizes you, and then they'll be looking for a green car." This Odo came in, and he had a panel car. My dad said he knew what he would do. Paint the car white. He painted the panels white. My mother got one of her kitchen aprons and gave him that. When he got stopped, they thought he was in the meat business. He had a whole load of whiskey in the back. He thought Dad was a hero for saving him then and there, but later on, as I said, he got shot. I remember one time the revenuers were chasing somebody and they thought it was a booze car. Finally they got close enough and shot the hell out of the booze car. They shot the goddamn gas tank. They pulled into Dad's place. A man and his wife almost died. They would have gotten in big trouble shooting at somebody who was innocent. Anyway, Dad got them in the restaurant, settled them all down, helped them reach a settlement between the troopers and the people so that the revenue officers didn't get turned in. Dad told a couple that he'd fix their car up. A couple of days later, they were on their way to Montreal. That's how things happen with Dad. Well, Dad had a lot of car agencies. He had 5 types of gas. Nowadays, you can't do that. You can't sell 5 types of gas at one pump, but Dad did. They tried to stop him. Legally, he was right. He had papers drawn up, and one gas was in Jimmy's name. He was about 5. One was in my mother's name. One was in his name. One was in my name. And the other he could have because he had Texaco across the street where I live now. Then he sold the same way with the cars, Flints and Whippets and Chrysler. And he told, the people that. And they said, "Well, you can't do that, man. We're going to close you up. You can't display Chrysler in the same showroom at Flint." And Dad said, "Why not? I don't sell Chrysler. That's my son. I just rent him space, and that's not illegal." Well, this restaurant where he had upstairs was a dance hall on the 3rd floor. Then he had a room on the 2nd floor, and downstairs he had an apartment for my mother and us. One night was a Dempsey Furpo. They were having a fight, and it was going to be broadcast. Radios were new. The only people in town who had radios were Clayton Lemoy and Medson Cooper and Larry Havens. Larry Havens built all 3 radios so they could get West Virginia. Anyway, they were going to broadcast the Dempsey fight, and everybody wanted to listen to the fight. They said to Clayton, "Can you come over to the restaurant and listen to the fight?" And he said, Sure. Then Clayton's mother heard about it. She was a mean woman, and not well liked, I'll tell you. She was crabby. And ugly, too. She said that they couldn't listen to the fight because they would come over after supper and not buy anything in the restaurant. He didn't want to disappoint all the men in the town and say his mother wouldn't let him do something, so he set the speaker, an old Atwater Kent radio, out on the porch where the post office is. They put the speaker out. Dad looked around at all the people. I have to say that my dad was rather cunning. He had to be smart to come from where he did, the heart of hard knocks, the school of the hearts. There were hundreds of people standing there. All the people gathered round. Dad came home that night and told my mom that he was going to Pennsylvania the next day. She said, "Whatever for?" He said, "I'm going to take out a radio distributorship." So the next morning he left for a few days, and he came back with the end of his car loaded with radios and speakers and dry cell batteries. He didn't buy the wet batteries because he planned to sell the people the batteries from the garage. The first thing that he did to sell these radios was to show me how to hook up an antenna. We'd go to a farmer, for example. We went to Pete Lapiro's house and told him that he had something that he wanted to show him. Said, "What is it?" And Dad said, "Well, come on now and I'll show you." And so we would bring a radio into the house. While he was there, he told me to hook the antenna to the barn into the house. I went outside, hooking it up and then running it through the kitchen window. Pete said, "We don't want to see it. We can't afford a radio." Dad said, "I'm not trying to sell you anything. I just wanted you to see what the radio's like." He said, "I can't buy it." And Dad said, "I don't want you to buy it. I just want to set it up and show you." And then the woman was all excited and wanted to hear, and Dad said, "You know where that's coming from? That's New York City." And he turned the dial and said, "You know where that's coming from? That's Wheeling, West Virginia." Dad said, "Look, I got to go somewhere." And Pete said, "What about the radio?" Dad said, "Well, I don't have the time to unhook it. I'll come over and get it in a couple of days. You play with it as much as you want while I'm gone." So he'd be gone about a week, and he'd drive up and say that he was back to pick up the radio. Now, Mrs. Lapiro said she hated to see the radio go. She was getting all kinds of recipes, canning, everything that you can think of for the household. And a guy said, "You know, I started to listen to the weather there, and it was pretty accurate there." And, well, Dad said, "How much money you got?" Now, I forgot what the price was. It was probably around $40, which was a lot of money back then. Well, the guy said he had 11, and his wife had 6 in a sugar bowl, so that was 17, and Dad told him that he needed a good heifer cow. So he asked for the cash and the cow, and they would be square. When they needed the battery charged once a month to come down to the garage, and he would charge it for them. He was always dealing. So they did, and he sold radios all over the North Country like that. I guess that he covered all of Essex and Clinton County with the new radio systems of the day. I remember one time that he had an auction with horses. He advertised. The horses came up on the railroad in Osable. Then he would have some fellows drive 50 horses or so, like the cowboys, up to Upper J. Then he would put on the ads for the 11 o'clock, and then he told the auctioneer, "Be late." So it was close to lunchtime, and they wouldn't be able to start the auction till 1 o'clock, and the guys would say, "What the hell, we might as well go in and have a few beers and some dinner." Finally, the auctioneer would come in around 1 o'clock, and the auction was going, and about every 20 minutes they'd take a break, and they'd rush over to the bar and have a few more drinks. And this would go on till around 4 o'clock. The next day they'd come back for their horses. Dad always did manage to get an extra meal or a few more drinks out of somebody. Oh, I told you he was smart. At Christmas time during the war, any soldier wouldn't take their stamps for gas. He was very patriotic. After the war, it was business. All through those days, people remembered him, and they were his customers. Junior was thinking of going into the plumbing business. Dad said he had just the car for him with the hooks on the side to hold pipe. Of course, it could have been for a ladder or anything. Junior wanted to look at it. The body didn't look so bad. There were no doors. He looked at that and noticed a crack in the windshield. Dad said that didn't make any difference, a crack in the windshield. It won't hurt it. Junior wanted to know how it ran, and Dad said it ran as good as the day it came from Detroit, just like new. Junior looked under the hood and wanted to know, "What's that big white streak running down the block?" Dad said that was just a little leak, won't hurt anything. They just had the car overhauled. He looked at the tires, he kicked the tire and noticed that it was right down to the canvas. Dad told him that it had run him a long time yet. That tire was okay. So they started it up. Dick Carey, one of Dad's flunkies, started the car for him, cranked it there. Junior wanted to test it in the big field where the land of make-believe is right now. There were no brakes. He kept on going around in a circle till it stopped. Dad said he hadn't told him there were good brakes. He said, "I never told you there were good brakes on the car. I just said the car will eventually come to a stop." That car would still make him a good car. I just wanted you to get on well. Junior wanted to know how much was well-meaning, and Dad said, "Well, I'm asking $500. Junior said, "I think the car's maybe worth $200. Dad said, "I guess the deal's off." Junior told him, "You'll never sell that car," and Dad assured him that he would. Somebody will be along and think they got a good deal. A week later, Dad told Junior that somebody had come along and given him $400 for the car. Junior wondered, how the hell does he do it? Dad was a kind-hearted man, too. A man owed him $600 to $700 and stopped coming around. He used to be a good customer. Dad finally asked about Ed Standel, a florist. Why he never came in anymore. He told Dad, he said, "Well, I'm ashamed that I owe you so much money." Dad said, "You sit down here and have a drink." He went into the office and came back and said, "Here." Ed said, "What's this?" He said, "Read it. It says, 'This bill is paid in full.'" But Guy said, "I never paid it." So Dad told him that he never owed him anything. I remember at Christmas time, before welfare, he would get the name of people in the vicinity of 5 miles, and he used these beer cases. And he would go and take a big box, and every one of them he would put a turkey or a chicken, depending on the size of the family, a bottle of wine, and he always put Italian bread in. He put in cheese, fruit, candy, canned peas, and everything for everyone. If they had kids, he'd get little toys, mostly books or crayons that they could use. And that would be my brother and my Christmas Eve job. We'd start delivering these packages all over. He would do things like that. Then he got into making money. He would share it with other people. One time he wasn't selling cars, and my mother said that she had to go to Plattsburgh, and that afternoon he bought her a Model T Roadster. She got her girlfriend, and they went to Plattsburgh for the afternoon. After 1927, he decided that we should go to Italy to see my grandmother. I was about 10 years old. He took us to Italy with my mother. He lived in a little town called Catanano in the hills. There wasn't much for my mother and I to do. My aunt was a lady doctor. She bought a city block and had her office there. We stayed there with my grandmother. The kitchen was about as big as this shop. My grandmother's job was to keep the fireplace going. They did have electric lights, not like we have. In the kitchen was a table about 15 foot long with chairs all around it. During the holidays, people would start coming in, breakfast time right through until midnight. They would sit and eat, drink wine, eat fruit. The women would be there cooking, and everyone would stop in and eat. The next day it would go on. I never saw so many people at the same table at once. My uncle had a little house of his own where he kept his concubines, 3 of them, I don't know how many, that he could do. My mother asked my aunt if she minded that he had all those girlfriends out back. As long as they stay out there and don't interfere with my running of the household, she said, I no mind. She was a good doctor. My other aunt was a nun and came down to spend a week with us while we were in Italy. We stayed there for 6 months. Dad rented a car and a man to drive us around. Our friends who went to Italy with us rented a horse. Then we would take the horse and rig and go around the countryside. Dad visited his old friends. They all borrowed money from him. My mother and I would stay in Kibi with my aunt and uncle down there. We lived in an upstairs apartment. He ran a taxi service, horse-drawn taxi, I remember. I used to ride all over the city. Then there was this little Italian fellow who had a furniture shop. He did beautiful carvings, so I spent a lot of time with him, and he let me use his tools and wood and stuff. That's how I got interested in building things. He used to smoke an old beat-up pipe, so that when I came back to America, Dad picked us up a couple of fancy pipes, and we sent them to him. I was a kid then, and lost track of all those people. In 1929, he decided to take his brother, Nick, who hadn't been as successful as Dad because of all those children. 11 kids, you know. Dad took him over to see the mother, who was now 99 years old. I couldn't speak Italian, so my grandmother and I would sit by the fireplace and talk, even though we didn't speak each other's language. We knew what we were saying. We went over to the old farm, which wasn't any bigger than my studio in Linda's area. There was a little barn attached to the house. The heat from the animals used to keep them warm, and a little fireplace. They used to use olive oil for burning their lamps at night. They had an outdoor well. It was a small farm. Dad always said he wanted an accordion because he was saving money to come to America. He started to make an accordion, and he left it on the rafters in the house. It was there. He'd never finished it, but it had the bellows on it. The reeds were made of some sort. The hand buttons were made out of the buttons from a shirt. It was about 12 inches high and 9 inches deep. It was lost during the flood. When we came back on the ship, the Casa Dacia, we ran into one of the roughest storms they had ever had the sea on to run into. I have pictures of some of these storms where the waves actually covered the whole ship. Man, I was sicker than a dog. Jimmy didn't get sick. We stayed at New York City for a week. Dad took us to the Hippodrome Theater, which was very famous in those days. He took us to museums and bought us clothes and took us home. Then he took Nick over, and they were gone for about 3 months. The garage burned down after that. In those days, garages were messy. They used a blowtorch, and the washer caught fire and spread across the floor. He bought the hotel and the gas station across the street. He turned the gas station into a store and restaurant. When Prohibition ended, he took the store and he made it into a bar. I was doing very poorly in school. It was about this time that I met a man called Rockwell Kent. He admired the murals that I had on the walls and told me that he thought that I could be a great artist. I said that my father wanted me to be a lawyer, and my mother wanted me to be a doctor, but I knew that I just couldn't take school anymore, and I wanted to quit. Rockwell talked to my father and convinced him that I should be an artist. A lot of well-known people came up for dinner at Louie's. They'd come in around 6 o'clock at night and they'd stay until 1 o'clock in the morning. Dad was funny. He was like a comedian. Directors, producers, movie stars, and songwriters came to his tavern, and later on they helped me in my career in California. Rockwell thought that I could go to the Pratt Institute of Manhattan, so Mrs. Wells, who lived across the street in a yellow house, she was a friend of Mrs. Pratt, and some way to Rockwell got a hold of her and got me into the art school. This was right in the Depression. They accepted me and I got high marks, and then I went on to Hollywood. I had $15 a week for room and board. The tuition was $120 for the year. I made a lot of friends in New York and Brooklyn. After the war, Dad and Mother got divorced while I was in the Army. They never did get along that well. Gladys and I lived with Dad. He was a great guy. We moved away and he remarried, and we didn't think two families should live together. After he married her, we moved up to Teresa's. I helped him out for a while. Glad and I went back to California, and Dad dated a new girl, and I found him my new Corvette to romance her. She moved in and became the boss, and he let her become the boss. I started a new toy factory and decided to build a land of make-believe. Anyway, I decided to put it in the back lot, and Dad had the restaurant next door. The Northway came in and hurt the business. He managed the restaurant for 4 or 5 years, but he started coughing really bad. We found out that Dad had emphysema from smoking 2 packs of cigarettes a day. The doctor called and he said, "Dad's not doing so well." So Jimmy and I hopped a plane and went to California to see him. He died a couple days later. Just before he died, we found out that his ex-wife was taking him for the money. She got everything because she told him when he was sick in the hospital she'd found a new bank where they could double their interest, and so he rallied. She took all the money in her name. This meant that his ex-wife got everything. The only thing that she didn't get was the emergency money in Plattsburgh that Jimmy and I used to pay for our expenses. We agreed that the way life is, and that was the end of it. He's buried in the Upper J Cemetery under a nice big tree. He was really a great guy and did a lot for a lot of people. They loved him, and so did I. This is Otto Monaco, signing off.